All right, well, we're back for another tutorial, and as fate would have it, we have a guest. This is Laura, and Laura she is a friend of Biddy, as you can tell by her attire, and she had a unique problem that I thought would make for an interesting video. So, Laura, show us what you got.
I have an antique, well, I think it's a bracelet. I got this at an antique store in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And the tag said bracelet, but it almost doesn't look like a bracelet. It looks like one of those insulator.
Looks like somebody swiped it off a power line, but that's okay.
But it's huge and I love it and I want more of them. I want to stack my arms with bracelets. Luckily, Mitch has the ability to help me with this.
I do have that ability. So one of the reasons I thought this would make for an interesting video is if you look at that shape closely here, and this is where, hold on, I'm gonna, okay, so if you look at that shape closely, you can see right here, it almost looks like somebody held it to a bench grinder at a slight angle. So it's not exactly straight. We have a straight, like if you hold it here, you can see this is a cylinder, but then somebody took a bench grinder or something and put it at a rakish tilt there. So that presents an interesting set of problems for molding, just because now we're gonna have to mold this. If we put it this way, we're gonna have a gap right there, which is okay, but that's the other problem that this has, and again, which is why we're making a video about it, is we have that negative space inside. Now, this is one of those areas where material selection is really important. What we're going to do is we're gonna mold this with a soft silicone that we're gonna make so it can actually pull around, so the only seam is going to be on that edge of the part. So that minimizes our seams, which of course for production, when you're making your bracelets, then just makes it so you could easily hit that with a sander and clean up that edge, which is a little tricky when you're dealing with clear translucent materials. But the other thing we're going to do, because this mold is going to basically be a cylinder around the piece that goes in and around, to make it easier to compress and pull out, we're going to put a spacer or a plug or tube in the middle so that can all compress. And one last little detail, again, because we need this to be very soft and stretchy to easily pull around this part, because we don't want a lot of strain on that mold every time we open this up. So what we're gonna do is actually use one of our skin materials, the Skin Cast OO30, to make this negative mold, which is gonna be really soft. So I haven't done this before, so this is uncharted territory, but my idea here is that that's soft enough to then compress and pull out and all that. So
okay,
there you go.
Sounds like a plan.
So, okay, now, hold on, let me go back to a wider shot of, now, Laura, so that's my basic mold idea. So we're going to get the mold started first, but what was your idea for coloring and making these little guys?
For coloring, I would love one to match my hair. Because when you have fun colored hair, having stuff that matches it is great.
Okay, all right.
That would be ideal.
Excellent. So we're going to, I'm going to try not to turn this into a just straight up sales pitch, but we're going to use some of the new ArtKast Translucent once we get the mold made to cast this in translucent resin with some green polypig in it. So
excellent.
First things first, we're going to get the mold done, and for that I'm going to teleport to yesterday and do the mold. So this bracelet that we're going to mold, this is this acrylic bracelet that looks suspiciously like an electrical insulator. Presents an interesting set of problems because, one, we have this negative space in the middle. So I thought this would be a fun piece for us to video. We have to address this negative space, but also the astute viewer will notice that this is not level. So it looks like somebody took this to a bench grinder on one side or the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to cast it, since it doesn't sit level. We're going to go ahead and make it sit level on one side. We're going to attach this with hot glue. We're going to leave this open down here, and then the finished mold, we're going to take an X-Acto and cut that little part open. And that way we only have, the only seam that we're going to have on our piece is going to be right there on that edge, which will of course be easy to sand because that's already at an angle. So take that to a bench grinder and take that seam right off. So that will keep this nice and pristine and just one area of cleanup right there in theory. Now, because this is going to be possibly we might be casting this in some clear or other materials. Obviously this original cast has air bubbles all through it, but if we do it in clear, I'd like it to be nice and bubble free. So we're going to make sure we vacuum degas our silicone, which I won't show on camera because again, that's turf we've already covered in other videos. So, and if you haven't seen that, be sure to check the video links for the page for the poured block molds because we have a lot of detailed information on poured molds on that page. So anyway, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to secure this like this with a little bit of a gap right here. It's going to be very slight. And then we're going to cut any of that back that we need to because again, because that is a flat edge, that'll be easy to reproduce. Now the other thing is because we've got such a big open area, we could just fill that up with solid silicone, no problem at all, and then have the whole thing just pop off like that. But to conserve silicone, we're going to take one of our smaller diameter mold tubes and put that right in the middle. And that keeps our margin on our mold relatively thin, and that will make it easier for that to compress because that negative space inside, since it'll have the opening, we can compress that and pull it out. Now we're going to use one of our really soft new Skin Cast silicones for this, and the reason for that is we need this to have a decent elongation to pull around the part, but also we want that to be soft enough to compress and pull out. Now, because this is a relatively shallow mold, I mean, it is a cylinder shape, but if we were to go much higher than this, that mold with one of those soft silicones will start to move around and get kind of wonky. So we want to be really careful not to push our luck with what that can do. But what we're going to do for our configuration is we're going to put this tube in the middle and then this bigger mold tube that we usually use for hand casting on the outside. So again, that will minimize our thickness of silicone. And this is going to take right around, I've calculated it without this tube at about 2 pounds of silicone. So if you adjust for what's left over in the mixing cup and all that sort of thing, we'll probably still need about maybe 2 pounds, maybe a little less than 2 pounds of silicone to be at about 1/2 inch over our part. Now for the release agent, this is an important detail. I don't know exactly what plastic this is made of, but I don't want to take any chances on this sticking, so I'm going to use some of the Super Release PTR. Just a light spray on that, and then I'm actually going to wipe it off. Now the reason I'm doing that is once I put this in place, now I was careful, I tried to keep the mold release off that leading edge of the part, but I want to be careful to get this released before I configure my whole mold, because if I wait, I'm not going to be able to get in those grooves spraying from the top down. Now, many of you might be asking if I'm going to cut this tube down, and no, I'm not, and here's why. Because this kind of mold, because I've got that area underneath, I want to be able to tip this over. I want to be able to lean this mold over and allow any of air bubbles to come up to the surface that are down here. So what we do is it's one of those like a little puzzle with a little ball bearing. When we tilt it over, we know those air bubbles are going to want to go up and then tilt back down and they go up again. Now I want to remember that my mold opening is over here, that opening on the bottom is over here, so I'm going to mark that so we'll know when we go to tip that and move it around where that part is. Open. So we want to remember that, so when we get this all configured, we tilt that up and allow any air bubbles to come up to the surface. Now again, the whole idea here is to minimize the seams and make it so any grinding or any touch-up that we have to do is on a part the finished part, the finished cast, that will be flat. So it will be conducive to putting up to a bench grinder and cleaning it up. Now what I'm doing here is just putting down a little circle of hot glue, and then I'm going to take my little tube and smear it around in there to pick up that glue, and then you can turn it and get that glue spread out. Okay, with that in place, we're ready to put the outside of our mold on. And again, our clearance is about a little under an inch all the way around and on the inside. Now this is where we want to be really careful to make sure we don't have any leaks. On that inner tube, if that were to leak and that filled up, not the end of the world. We'd wind up using more silicone than we want, but it's not going to affect the quality or the function of the mold. Whereas this, if we get a leak on this outside tube, we're going to wind up with an expensive puddle, and we don't want that. Okay, one last spray of release, and now we're ready to mix up our silicone. Okay, we're ready to mix up and pour our silicone. Now, again, we are going to vacuum degas this. This is a relatively low viscosity silicone. I think this one is around 4,000 or 5,000 centipoise. So this pours pretty low viscosity, but still, anytime we're pouring a mold like this, where later on we might be pressure casting, always a good idea to vacuum degas. And to that end, we want to make sure we have plenty of room in our mixing cup for the material to expand and collapse under that vacuum. So remember, if you start getting over halfway up on some materials, if you're dealing with really thick silicones, you want to give yourself even more room than that. But we want to make sure we have enough room for our silicone to expand and collapse. Now, Skin Cast OO30, this is a really nice, soft, squishy skin material, almost like your earlobe. Think like really soft like that. And again, we need that elongation, that compression, so we can pull out that center piece on this mold. And this is mixed 1-to-1 by weight. And my calculations on this are about a pound of A and a pound of B. And just for those of you curious, a pound translates to right around 460 or so grams. So this has a working time of about 15 to 20 minutes at room temperature, and it is nice and hot here in Texas right now, so I want to make sure I move fast, but I want to make sure you don't whip air into the mixture. So scrape and stir deliberately, but don't. This is where mechanical mixing with a drill can really mess things up for you. So make sure you take time to scrape the sides, the bottom of the container, get all of that incorporated, and then subject that to a vacuum. So if you're curious about the vacuum degassing process, definitely check the video description for a link in there to our poured block mold page. Okay, our silicone has been vacuum degassed, so we're ready to make our pour. And remember, this is the side that's open at the bottom. And almost exactly 2 pounds of silicone. Had just a little bit left over. And again, because we want that any bubbles to come to the surface that are under here, we're just going to tilt that back. So remember that heat will speed up the set time of the silicone, whereas cold will slow it down. But real important, don't drop down below about 65 degrees or your silicone starts to have a whole new set of problems of not curing properly. So real important to remember that if you're here like I am in a hot Texas warehouse, you want to make sure you move fast and that you've given yourself enough time to evacuate air bubbles or whatever needs to happen, pigmenting or whatever you need to do. And now we're going to leave it alone and let that set up. So again, we have about a 4 to 5 hour cure time, and then we're going to see what kind of casting we can do with this. Okay, so I went ahead and let this sit overnight. So our mold is completely cured. And again, got my instructions there, and I have my, my box cutter ready to open this up. And again, the whole reason for that tall mold tube was so I could tilt that over. So we're gonna see how well that worked. Okay, so we've got our tube on the inside to take up some of that volume, and I'm gonna work that off of here, and I'm gonna have my assistant Rupert step in again. And Rupert, you don't mind pulling on that in a non-weird way?
Not this again.
There we go. Okay, and you can see right here we have this part of the bracelet is in the silicone, so we're going to cut that out carefully. And to do that, we're going to use a sharp pointy thing known as a scalpel. So we're just going to cut a slit right down into that. Again, the whole idea behind this mold design is to minimize seams. And where we have to have a seam, we want to put that seam in a place that's going to be easy to remove or grind. So it's on a straight edge, and again, we just park that up against a bench grinder, take it right off. And this is, again, this is one of the reasons we use that really soft skin silicone, so we can easily compress this core and pull that out. Rupert, do you mind giving me a hand here again? Here we go. Thank you, sir. Alrighty, and even though this is a soft silicone, this is a pretty simple mold, and because that seam is right there on the top, that realigns easily. And now we're just gonna clean up the little bit of silicone on that edge, and we are ready for casting. Okay, Laura, it is now. We teleported back to yesterday and got the mold that I made from the time machine, so now we have our finished silicone mold in the Skin Cast OO30. So again, normally for most block mold applications, this would be like ridiculously soft, but because we need to pull that complicated shape out, we're about to find out whether or not that works or not. So, so here is our finished mold, and for the record, this took right at about almost exactly 2 pounds of silicone when you count what was left over in the bucket and all that. So those of you budgeting for something about this size, we might have been able to squeeze that a little smaller, but 2 pounds is probably an appropriate amount if you keep your mold walls relatively tight on something like that. And again, that important part here where we left that middle hollow with about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch margin there, so that can compress and then pull out. So now we're ready for our casting. So you said you wanted green, correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Of course.
All right, so we're gonna get cracking, and I understand you might have a connection to our helper the other day in the previous video, Rupert?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right, I thought there was a connection there, but alas, my monkey brain my chemical-addled brain can't always remember these things. So, okay, so we're gonna get started with some casting, and again, we're gonna cast, our piece is gonna look probably a little bit less clear than this.
Okay.
It is comforting to me to know that whoever made this one did not, air bubbles, they tossed caution to the wind, and air bubbles were not a thing, which again supports the case that this may actually have been an insulator of some type. But anyway, we are going to transition now to casting. Okay, all right, Laura, we are ready for casting. So,
excellent.
First things first, what we're going to do is, even though this resin that we're going to be using, I don't know if this is a denser or a lower density resin than what was used on this. This feels like some kind of acrylic, whereas we're going to be pouring polyurethane resin. So probably a little different density, but to at least arrive at a somewhat close proximity of the weight, we're going to weigh this on our scale, and that comes to 220 grams. Okay, so 220 grams. So because obviously we don't know if this is, again, higher or lower density than this resin, we're gonna mix up more than we need. So we've got a little bit extra, and I've got some other little molds on standby that we can pour some of that leftover resin in. But one thing I always like to do anytime, even when we know exactly how much this takes, we want to make sure we mix up a little bit extra, just because you're never going to get every drop out of that mixing cup and into the mold. So we got our mold ready to go, and we've got some of our green poly pig with Larry's cute little pig that he drew, and we're ready to mix up our resin. I'm going to go ahead and mix up the first one, but depending on how involved you want to be with this, once you see this, if you want to jump in and mix up the second one,
I would love to.
We'll do that. So now, one thing I always like to do is pour my part B first.
Is there a reason why you would pour part B first?
Why, yes, there is, Laura. We can get the color close to what we want or where we want it exactly before the clock starts ticking down, because we have 3 minutes, so we got to move quick.
Okay.
Now, I'm just going to start with just a drop, or just a couple of drops.
So I've watched a few of your videos before, and once the part A goes in, that's when your timer starts. And
that's exactly right. You have paid attention. You are awesome.
Hooray.
Now, how about that? What does that look like?
Me. That looks, let's see, can we do a little darker?
But of course, does a one-legged duck swim in a circle?
I don't know. I've never met a one-legged duck.
My daughter actually looked it up, and she's like, a one-legged duck really does swim in a circle.
Nice.
This is the benefit to just using the B first and adding our pigment, because now we have that ability to adjust it accordingly.
Okay.
So does that look good, or you want to go darker?
Let's see. Is it possible to add yellow or no?
Well, we're going to add a little bit of yellow in the form of this. So I'd say we could do that, and then, because that's going to change it very slightly, but we'll do that first.
This looks perfect as far as like the depth of color goes. Oh, that is indeed looking better. All right, so now our timer has started.
It has, and one interesting thing about this formula that I found out the other day, you can actually go a little bit more part A and get a little higher clarity. So we may play around with that too.
Excellent.
But yeah, that actually is kind of a hazy clear.
Excellent.
Okay. Now overall, the shape that you've got on your bracelet is fairly smooth, so I'm not too worried about air bubbles trapping on the side of this as it's filling up. I'm mainly concerned about this area right here. Okay. So I'm just going to open that up and then close it to allow any air bubbles to come to the surface. But I don't want to overfill it. I want to see how this comes out, and then we'll play around with some other techniques. But for our first cast, we're going to keep it relatively simple.
Perfect.
Okay, we're back. And we're ready to demold our bracelet.
About how long would you say it's been?
Good question, Laura. Thanks for the softball questions. Appreciate that. It's been approximately maybe 30 minutes or so.
Okay.
And this, of course, being a hot Texas day, and heat, of course, accelerating everything, will speed everything along markedly. Now, one little tidbit, I don't know how visible that is, but that little drip of resin right there, we're going to use that to gauge what's happening in our mold. Now, we already had a test part that we demolded off camera, but just so you can see, any little drip like this is a great chance to test the resin. And with ArtKast Translucent, this particular resin formula doesn't just snap cure. It cures to where you could demold it, but it's going to go through a phase where it's almost like a firm rubber material. And then it will continue to cure for the next hour or two till it's a full hardness of about 75D. So it'll be really hard once it completely cures, but just know that it's going to go through that state. So, and if it's in a thin cross section, it'll be in that state longer. So
should I do anything with the bracelet to make sure I don't do certain things to?
Well, so this is thick enough that I don't think it could warp, but that's a good question. So you don't want to, you know, if it was sitting on its side, that might be an issue. So I would just say set on a level surface.
Okay.
But we're going to go ahead and peel away this inside section. And now the moment of truth. Again, this is going to be awesome. All right, Laura, you ready?
Goodness, yes.
Careful, this plate is hot.
Okay. Look at that! Oh my goodness!
Is it
This
everything you
awesome.
hoped and dreamed it would be?
And more.
And it feels mildly radioactive because of the heat. Now, so you can see that little lip there as foretold in the prophecy. There's that little bit of plastic right there, and that's going to be very easy to trim. So we just come back and clean that up and then grind this down, and we have a very nice bracelet. Okay, so before we do any proper cleanup on this, I'm just going to peel back a little bit of that, but you can see in that little section how it's a little bendy, but the bracelet it's definitely nice and firm. So try it on, check it out.
All right. Oh, it's very warm. Look at this. Oh, are we? Have we started filming yet?
We are going,
Okay.
yes. So,
Look. Oh my goodness. I feel like Wonder Woman.
okay, so we have done our casting, and we did our casting and grinding without our wireless mics on, so I'm just going to go over that process really quick. We cast a variety of different parts from our uber soft Skin Cast OO30 mold. And because we do have this area, this funky area like I was talking about in the mold making part of the process, we did have to take that to a grinder and grind off that edge. And then of course we can wet sand that to get rid of all the that seam. But overall it worked as predicted in the prophecy, and Laura has many bracelets of many different colors.
Yes, I feel like Wonder Woman.
So yes, it is awesome, and you got to play with the different poly pig colors and
Yes,
color
these.
them accordingly.
Yep. You can see that some of these have different opacity levels. Like this one has less of the color, so it's not quite as opaque as like these two have a lot. And so it was a lot of fun mixing colors, getting to mix up the elements and pour them into here. So thank you so much for letting me come down and make some bracelets.
You're welcome, and yeah, and thanks for working in our well-ventilated, totally safe, OSHA-approved shop.
Of course.
So yeah, so now we have our finished mold ready for more casts. And again, just if I was to do this over again, I'd probably use a slightly firmer silicone than this. This was the Skin Cast OO30, which worked well for this, and we still have a mold that'll produce more casts, but probably would have been a little better to go a little bit firmer. So in the video description, I'm going to put some links to other silicone formulas that would also work like this, but maybe be slightly firmer, like the Skin Cast OO50. Thanks again for watching, and of course, all of the products in our videos are available on our website at brickintheyard.com, and you can always be sure to check the video description for all the product links and the additional video library links. And Laura, thanks again for coming out, and thank you for watching, and be sure, if you haven't already, like and subscribe, and of course click the little bell icon so you get notified when we put out new content. And thanks again, Laura.
You're very welcome.